who cried, "Imagine this. The scorching sun's beating down on the dusty plains of what's now Pakistan. It's February 17 ke 1843. A British general stands facing an army of 22,000 warriors. He's got just 2,800 men. The odds? Nearly 8 to 1 against. His officers are whispering that this is absolute madness, that they should leg it whilst they still can, that there's no more way they can possibly win. The general turns to them, still in his eyes, and he says, 'We've got no more choice but to fight, and we will win.' 3 hours later, the battlefield's littered with 5,000 enemy dead. British losses? 62 men. How on earth did that happen? This is the story of one of the most audacious military campaigns in history, a conquest that added 50,000 square miles to the British Empire in mere weeks, and sparked a controversy that's still debated today. And at the heart of it all was a man unlike any other officer in the British Army, Major General Sir Charles James Napier. Main content to understand what happened in Sindh in 1843, you need to understand Charles Napier himself. Because blimey, was this bloke different from your typical British officer? He was 60 years old when he arrived in India. 60. Most generals that age were enjoying retirement in comfortable country estates, reminiscing about the good old days. Napier was just getting started on his greatest campaign. Born in 1782 into a distinguished military family, Napier had spent his entire adult life at war. His father was a colonel. His mother was Lady Sarah Lennox, connected to some of the most powerful families in Britain. Military service wasn't just expected in the Napier family, it was practically compulsory. Charles joined the army at 12 as an ensign, which was normal for aristocratic boys back then. But unlike many wealthy officers who bought their commissions and treated it like a hobby, Napier took it deadly seriously from day one. He studied military history obsessively, learned French, Spanish, and later Hindustani and Persian. He read everything about warfare he could get his hands on, from ancient Greek and Roman tactics to Napoleon's campaigns. Whilst other young officers were gambling and getting blooded, Napier was in his quarters reading Xenophon and Caesar, analyzing how ancient commanders won battles against superior numbers. His baptism of fire came early. In 1800, aged 18, he fought in Ireland during the rebellion. Then came the Napoleonic Wars, where Napier would prove his courage and nearly die in the process. He served in Portugal and Spain during the Peninsular War. In January 1809, at the Battle of Corunna, everything changed. The British army was retreating to the coast, pursued by French forces. Napier was commanding a company when they came under heavy attack. A musket ball struck him in the face, shattering his jaw. He kept fighting. A French cavalry saber sliced open his scalp. He still kept fighting. Then a French infantryman drove a bayonet completely through his body, the blade entering his back and emerging from his chest. Napier collapsed, bleeding from multiple wounds. His men thought he was dead. He probably should have been dead. Most soldiers who suffered even one of those wounds would have died. Napier had suffered all three simultaneously. He was left on the battlefield as the British retreated. French soldiers found him hours later, still breathing somehow, and took him prisoner. They were so impressed by his courage and the fact he was still alive that they treated his wounds and eventually returned him to British lines in a prisoner exchange. The recovery took months. His jaw never fully healed. The bayonet wound should have killed him. Yet somehow, he survived. These experiences shaped Napier profoundly. He'd looked death in the face and he survived. He had no more fear of danger anymore, having already experienced the worst war could offer. But he also developed a deep contempt for aristocratic officers who'd never seen real combat, who treated warfare as a gentlemanly game, who knew nothing about actual fighting but commanded men anyway because of their social connections. Napier believed military rank should be earned through competence and courage, not purchased with family money. This attitude made him extremely unpopular with the British military establishment. After recovering, Napier returned to service. He fought in the War of 1812 against the United States, served in Bermuda, then was sent to the Ionian Islands in Greece where he served as governor for several years. His times revealed another side, his administrative ability and the relatively progressive views for his time. He built roads, improved sanitation, established schools, tried to reduce corruption. He learned Greek and he made genuine efforts to understand local culture. He defended the rights of locals against exploitation by British merchants and the officials, which again made him enemies among the British establishment. By the early 1840s, Napier was in his late 50s, expecting to retire soon. Then came the disaster in Afghanistan. In 1839, the British had invaded Afghanistan, installing a puppet ruler. They thought they'd achieved easy victory. They were catastrophically wrong. In 1841, the Afghans rose in rebellion. The British garrison in Kabul, along with thousands of camp followers and their families, attempted to retreat to India in winter. It was a massacre. Of approximately 16,500 people who left Kabul, only one man reached the British garrison at Jalalabad. The rest were killed or died from cold and starvation. One of the worst military disasters in British history. The British government and the East India Company were desperate to restore prestige and secure their northwestern frontier. They needed someone tough, experienced, someone who wouldn't be intimidated by difficult odds. They thought of Charles Napier. In 1842, they offered him command of military forces in Sindh, a region on the Indus River bordering Afghanistan. Napier accepted. He arrived in Sindh in late 1842 and immediately began planning what would become his most famous campaign. But why did the British want Sindh? The geopolitical situation was complex. The East India Company had been expanding control over the Indian subcontinent for nearly a century through trade, diplomacy, and the military conquest. But significant territory remained independent or semi-independent. Sindh was one of these. It wasn't a unified state but rather a collection of territory ruled by different amirs, Muslim princes who governed their own domains. The most powerful amirs were based in Hyderabad, controlling the lower Indus Valley. These amirs had treaties with the East India Company. In exchange for British protection and the trade privileges, the amirs agreed to maintain friendly relations and allow British merchants to operate. For the most part, the amirs had kept these agreements. Sindh had been relatively peaceful, but the Afghan disaster changed everything. The British were paranoid about their northwestern frontier. They feared Russia might expand southward through Central Asia into India. They feared the Afghans might invade. They feared local rulers who'd witnessed British defeat might think the empire was weak. The British wanted to secure every advantage along that northwestern frontier, and that meant controlling Sindh. The Indus River was strategically crucial. Control of the river meant control of a major transportation route. Control of Sindh meant a secure buffer zone between British India and the potentially hostile Afghanistan. But there was a problem. The amirs hadn't violated their treaties. They hadn't attacked British interests. Under existing agreements, the British had no more legitimate reason to take direct control of Sindh. This is where Charles Napier came in. The Governor-General of India, Lord Ellenborough, wanted Sindh conquered, but he couldn't simply order an unprovoked invasion. That would be too blatant, too likely to cause political problems in London. So the strategy was more subtle. Ellenborough gave Napier vague orders to secure British interests and to maintain stability. He didn't explicitly order conquest, but everyone understood what was expected. Napier was to create a situation where conquest would appear necessary or justified. Napier understood his role perfectly. In his private journals, which are absolutely fascinating, he wrote with remarkable honesty about what he was doing. He wrote that conquering Sindh would be morally wrong, that the amirs had done nothing to deserve losing their territory, that Britain was acting like a bully and a thief. He called the impending conquest a crime. These are extraordinary admissions, rare examples of a colonial conqueror explicitly acknowledging the injustice of his actions even as he planned to carry them out. But Napier also wrote that he believed British rule would ultimately benefit the people of Sindh, that the amirs were incompetent and the corrupt rulers, that British administration would bring order, justice, and the progress. He convinced himself that even though the means were wrong, the end result would justify them. This self-justification was common among Victorian imperialists, but Napier's written record is unusually explicit. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but he constructed a worldview where it was also necessary and ultimately beneficial. When Napier arrived in Sindh, he immediately began comprehensive intelligence gathering. He traveled extensively, often in disguise or with minimal escort, personally observing the terrain, cities, fortifications, and the people. Most senior officers stayed in comfortable headquarters and they relied on reports. Napier wanted to see everything with his own eyes. He visited markets, talked with merchants and the farmers, studied the Amir's military forces. He made detailed notes about everything. What Napier discovered was a region with significant military forces but little modern organization. The Amirs could call upon tens of thousands of warriors, fierce fighters with experience in tribal conflicts, but these forces weren't trained in European tactics. They didn't fight in disciplined formations. The weapons were mostly outdated, matchlock muskets and the swords rather than modern rifles and the artillery. Most importantly, they had no more experience fighting a European military force. They didn't understand how devastating disciplined volley fire could be. Napier also discovered the Amirs didn't entirely trust each other. Each maintained his own military forces and he made his own decisions. There was no more unified command, no more central planning. This meant even though total military forces were formidable, they likely wouldn't act as a unified army. Napier could potentially defeat them one at a time. But Napier needed more than intelligence. He needed a pretext for war. So in late 1842 and the early 1843, the British began making new demands on the Amirs. These demands were presented as necessary updates to treaties after the Afghan War, but in reality, they were designed to be unacceptable. The British demanded the right to station troops anywhere in Sindh that the Amirs paid for these British troops exclusive control over the industry for that the Amirs submit all foreign policy to British approval and the huge payments for alleged treaty violations. These demands were outrageous. They would have effectively ended Sindh's independence. The Amirs protested, arguing they'd kept existing treaties faithfully, that these new demands violated agreements, that they couldn't afford what the British were demanding. They pleaded for moderation, for negotiation. The British response was ultimatums: accept the demands or face military action. Napier made it clear he had a large force ready and he wouldn't hesitate to use it. He moved troops closer, conducting highly visible military exercises. The message was clear: submit or be destroyed. In January 1843, the situation exploded. British residents in Hyderabad were attacked by some of the Amir's followers. The historical record's unclear about exactly what happened. Some accounts suggest it was spontaneous uprising by warriors furious about British demands. Others suggest it was a deliberate provocation, possibly even encouraged by British agents wanting an excuse for war. What's clear is the British Residency was surrounded by hostile forces, though no more British personnel were actually killed. It was threatening but not murderous. Napier seized on this incident as his justification. He declared the Amirs had violated treaties by attacking British representatives, that this was an act of war, and he'd now use force. He sent an ultimatum: surrender immediately or face military conquest. He gave them just days to respond. The Amirs had a terrible choice: submit and lose independence without a fight, or resist militarily even though they'd likely lose. Different Amirs made different decisions, but enough chose resistance to give Napier his war. The Amirs began gathering forces. By mid-February 1843, an army had assembled near the village of Miani, about 6 miles from Hyderabad. This army numbered approximately 22,000 men, including cavalry, infantry, and the artillery. They took up a strong defensive position along a dried riverbed called the Fuleli, which provided a natural obstacle with steep banks. They planted their banners, prepared weapons, and waited. Napier had about 2,800 men. His force included the 22 ND Regiment, one of the British Army's regular infantry units with distinguished combat record. He also had the 25 TS Native Infantry and the 12 TS Native Infantry, units of Indian soldiers commanded by British officers, known as sepoys. Professional soldiers, well-trained and experienced. A few companies of cavalry and the 12 artillery pieces, not a large force, and dwarfed by the enemy army at Miani. Any conventional assessment would have said Napier should wait for reinforcements or negotiate. Napier had no more intention of doing either. On February 17, 1843, Napier marched toward Miani. The day was brutally hot, temperatures exceeding 100 degrees. Troops wearing heavy woolen uniforms suffered intensely. They marched through dusted, coated throats and blinded eyes. Water was scarce. Men began collapsing from heat exhaustion, but Napier drove them forward. He knew delay would give the enemy time to strengthen their position. As they approached, Napier rode ahead with a few staff officers to personally reconnoiter the enemy. Extraordinarily risky. If enemy cavalry had spotted him, they could have captured or killed the British commander before battle even began. But Napier needed to see everything with his own eyes. He spent hours observing through his telescope, studying formations, terrain, artillery positions. His officers urged him to pull back. Napier ignored them, continuing until he'd seen everything. What Napier identified was a critical weakness. The dried riverbed curved, creating an angle where two sections of line met. This angle formed a salient, a point jutting forward. If Napier could get forces to that angle, they could fire into both sections simultaneously, creating devastating crossfire. The angle was also the boundary between forces commanded by different amirs, which might mean less coordination. This was the weak point. Napier assembled his troops and he gave orders. They'd advance in column formation directly toward the angle. They'd ignore casualties and maintain formation. When they reached the riverbed, they'd descend in order, reform at bottom, then assault up the far bank with bayonets. Artillery would provide covering fire. Cavalry would remain in the reserve. The orders were simple, deliberately so. In battle's confusion, complicated orders would be impossible to execute. Then Napier did something legendary. He mounted his horse and he rode to the very front of the column, positioning himself where every soldier could see him. He'd personally lead the advance, exposing himself to enemy fire alongside his men. This wasn't expected of generals. Senior commanders typically directed from safer positions. Napier was going to lead from the front at age 60. The advance began mid-afternoon. British columns moved forward, drums beating, colors flying, maintaining perfect formation despite heat and knowledge they were marching against an army 8 times their size. As they came within range, the Amir's forces opened fire. Musket balls began striking ranks. Artillery shot through columns. Men fell. Wounded cried out. But columns kept advancing, closing ranks as men fell, maintaining formation. This was what all the drilling was for, to maintain cohesion under fire. Napier rode at the front, completely exposed, making himself the most visible target. Enemy marksmen aimed at him specifically. Musket balls whistled past. His horse was struck, but he kept riding. It seemed impossible he'd survive, but survive he did, untouched despite concentrated fire for nearly 20 minutes. The soldiers following him, it must have seemed like divine protection. The general was invincible. If he could do this, they could too. The columns reached the dried riverbed. Now came the most difficult part, descending steep banks 15 to 20 feet down whilst under fire from above. Formations broke as men scrambled down. For several minutes, the British force was completely vulnerable, scattered across banks and the bottom, unable to maintain formation or return fire. The Amir's warriors saw their opportunity and surged forward, thousands rushing to crush the British whilst disorganized. This was the critical moment. If British and the Indian troops couldn't reform quickly, they'd be overwhelmed and slaughtered. British officers and the sergeants immediately began shouting orders, physically pushing men into position, reforming lines even as enemy warriors poured down banks. Within minutes, incredibly, the British had established defensive formation at the riverbed's bottom. Ranks formed up, loaded rifles, fixed bayonets. When the first wave reached them, they met not scattered soldiers but organized ranks ready to fight. The fighting became brutal close quarters combat. The confined space meant no more room for maneuver. It was infantry against infantry, bayonets and the rifle butts against swords and the spears, men grappling hand to hand. The 22 in the regiment faced the heaviest fighting. Wave after wave attacked, trying to break through by sheer weight of numbers. The fighting was so close soldiers could see enemy faces, hear war cries, smell blood and the gunpowder. But British discipline held. Soldiers had been trained for exactly this. They fought in ranks, supporting each other. Front rank firing then stepping back to reload while second rank stepped forward. They used bayonets with devastating efficiency, long blades giving them reach advantage. When warriors tried to rush the line, they met a wall of bayonets that shoot them down. The British soldiers were also equipped with percussion-top rifles, more reliable and faster to reload than matchlock muskets most of the Amir's forces used. This gave critical advantage in sustained firefight. The Indian sepoy regiments fought with equal discipline and courage. Professional soldiers who took pride in their regiments. They held their sections against repeated attacks. Napier's artillery, positioned where they could fire down into enemy formations, provided crucial support. Gunners worked their pieces with practiced efficiency, sending canister shot tearing through packed masses. The 12 British guns, though heavily outnumbered, inflicted disproportionate casualties because of superior training and positioning. For over an hour, battle raged with neither side gaining decisive advantage. The Amir's warriors fought with tremendous courage, attacking again and again despite heavy casualties. They were defending their homeland. Their motivation was strong, but courage without organization and modern tactics wasn't enough against British discipline. Slowly, painfully, British and Indian troops began pushing forward, climbing up the far bank, establishing positions where they could fire down into enemy forces. Napier personally directed critical movements, leading along the line despite danger, ordering units forward at key moments. His presence was everywhere. He seemed to have complete awareness of the entire battlefield. Once British troops gained high ground, battle dynamics shifted. Now they could fire down into the Amir's forces, and in their position at the angle meant they could create crossfire exactly as Napier had planned. Warriors who'd been attacking were now caught between two directions of fire. The Amir's commanders tried to adjust, but confusion and smoke made coordination nearly impossible. After 2 hours of continuous fighting, the Amir's line began to waver. Small groups began retreating. What had been organized offense became disorganized resistance. Napier saw the moment when the line would break. He ordered cavalry forward. Cavalry squadrons had been waiting. Now they charged, leading over the battlefield, catching the Amir's forces as they began retreating. Cavalry are most effective against troops already demoralized and breaking formation. The Amir's army broke. What had been retreat became rout. Thousands fleeing across the plain, pursued by British and Indian cavalry. The cavalry rode through them, cutting down anyone they caught. This was the most brutal part, when most casualties occurred. The fighting in the riverbed had been intense but contained. The pursuit was a massacre. 5,000 of the Amir's soldiers were killed, most during retreat and the pursuit. British and the Indian cavalry showed no more mercy. This was standard practice in the 19th century. When fighting finally ended, Napier surveyed the battlefield. Bodies were everywhere, most from the Amir's army. The British had lost 62 men killed and 194 wounded. This casualty ratio, roughly 80-1 in favor of the British, seems almost impossible. How could 2,800 men defeat 22,000 and suffer such light casualties? The answer lies in combination of factors Napier assembled: superior tactics, better training, more effective weapons, disciplined formations, brilliant battlefield command. Each factor individually would have provided some advantage. Combined, they created overwhelming force multiplication. But the battle also demonstrated harsh reality of 19th century colonial warfare. The technological and the organizational gap between European militaries and the traditional armies had become enormous. The warriors at Miani fought with courage equal to any soldiers in history. They were brave, motivated, defending their homes. But bravery wasn't enough. They faced an enemy with better weapons, organization, tactics, and years of professional training. The aftermath was chaotic. The Amir's army had been destroyed, but the Amirs themselves mostly survived and fled. Hyderabad, the main city, was now defenseless. Napier marched on the city expecting surrender. Instead, some Amirs wanted to continue resistance. Messages were sent, negotiations attempted, but Napier had no more patience for prolonged diplomacy. He surrounded Hyderabad and prepared to assault if necessary. The city's defenders chose not to fight. Hyderabad surrendered, but conquest wasn't complete. Some Amirs had escaped with portions of their forces intact. They retreated north, hoping to gather more warriors. Napier knew he couldn't allow them time to reorganize. Despite his troops being exhausted, despite the crushing heat, he pushed them forward. Speed was essential. Within weeks, Napier received intelligence another army was forming near Duba, close to Hyderabad. About 20,000 men. Once again, Napier was outnumbered roughly 7-1. Once again, his officers urged caution. Once again, he ignored them and ordered immediate attack. On March 24 TH, 1843, just over 5 weeks after Miani, Napier fought the Battle of Hyderabad, also known as Duba. The second battle followed similar pattern. The Amir's forces held strong defensive position. They'd learned from Miani, tried to prepare better defenses, but they were still fighting with same disadvantage. Napier used similar tactics, studying enemy position, identifying weak point, concentrating force, attacking with disciplined aggression. Fighting at Duba was, if anything, more intense. The Amir's forces knew this was likely their last chance. They fought with desperate courage, launching repeated counterattacks. Battle raged for several hours. But once again, British discipline and the firepower prevailed. The Amir's army was defeated, suffering thousands of casualties. British losses were again remarkably light, fewer than 300 total. With defeat at Duba, organized military resistance in Sindh collapsed. Remaining Amirs either fled or sought terms. Some escaped in neighboring territory. Others surrendered and were placed under British protection, essentially house arrest. Napier declared Sindh annexed to the British Empire. In just 5 weeks, with 2 major battles and a handful of smaller skirmishes, he'd conquered an entire country. Closing now, here's where the story gets properly interesting. According to popular history, after conquering Sindh, Napier sent a one-word telegram to his superiors in Calcutta, Pachavi. This is Latin for "I have sinned," but it's also in spoken English "Apunani have sinned." One word that was simultaneously confession of moral guilt and the announcement of military victory. Clever, literate, perfectly capturing the moral ambiguity of what Napier had done. It became one of the most famous military communications in history. There's just one problem. It almost certainly never happened. The earliest reference appeared not in military records but in Punch magazine in May 1843, submitted by a 17-year-old girl named Catherine Winkworth as a satirical joke. It was satire, not history, but the joke was so perfect, so seemingly characteristic of Napier's personality, that people began believing it was real. Did Napier actually send the dispatch? Almost certainly not. Yet the story persists because it feels true, because it captures something essential about Napier and the British imperial project. The real response in Britain was mixed and contentious. Some celebrated it as brilliant military achievement. Others questioned whether conquest had been necessary or legal. A parliamentary investigation was launched. What emerged was messy. The Amirs hadn't been perfect, but nothing clearly justified conquest. The investigation concluded somewhat equivocally that whilst Napier may have exceeded his authority, and whilst conquest may not have been absolutely necessary, it was nonetheless beneficial to British interests and would stand. As governor of Sindh, Napier implemented extensive reforms. He built roads, established more systematic legal system, worked to suppress practices like sati, established schools, built irrigation systems. By Victorian imperial standards, he was relatively enlightened. But enlightened imperialism is still imperialism. The people of Sindh hadn't asked for British rule, British roads, British legal systems. They'd been conquered and were now being reformed according to foreign ideas. Napier's later career was less dramatic. He continued as governor for several years, consolidating British rule. He was later offered command during the Crimean War but declined, citing age and the declining health. He died in 1853, 10 years after conquering Sindh. His reputation at death was mixed, celebrated as brilliant commander, controversial for aggressive methods. From military perspective, he was undoubtedly brilliant. His victories demonstrated tactical genius and the personal courage. But he was also an instrument of imperialism, a conqueror who subdued people wanting to remain independent, who manufactured crises to justify conquest. Any assessment of Napier has to grapple with this complexity. The conquest had lasting impacts. The tactics Napier developed influenced British Army colonial warfare for decades. The administrative systems became templates used elsewhere. For people of Sindh, conquest marked fundamental turning point. They went from subjects of local rulers to subjects of distant empire viewing them as inferiors. When British India was partitioned in 1947 and Sindh became part of Pakistan, it bore indelible imprint of Napier's conquest. History is full of people like Napier, neither heroes nor villains, but complicated human beings acting within constraints of their times. Understanding them requires acknowledging both accomplishments and the complicity in injustice. Napier chose to conquer Sindh even whilst recognizing conquest was morally questionable. That choice and its consequences are his historical legacy. If this deep dive has made you think, if it's challenged you to see imperial history in its full complexity, then brilliant. History is not about celebrating or condemning the past, but understanding it as fully and honestly as we can. Smash that like button and subscribe because we'll continue exploring these remarkable, controversial moments that shaped our world. There are more stories waiting, more brilliant commanders and the forgotten battles, more moral dilemmas and the strategic insights. The past has endless lessons for those willing to engage seriously. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the incredible, complicated story of history. Cheers for watching.